Well, welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I'm glad that you all have come along for this episode. And many people who follow this podcast know that I often allude to aspects of my childhood in evangelicalism as a whole. Some of you will even know that I worked at a Christian bookstore. So there's a lot of things that are going to be coming off of my tongue that are going to be, it might even seem like a therapy session today as we work through some of the history of what happened, what was going on in evangelical culture, not just in the 1990s, but what were the historical aspects, the foundations that led to Christian contemporary music, then much less to the praise and worship movement, of whatever we identify that as. So you're going to get more of that here in just a second when I introduce my guest. But first, this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are sending out trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we are doing that now for more students than ever in our history, particularly with the emergence of the Global Methodist Church. We now have 430 Global Methodist Church pastors in our seminary, 740 students with a real opportunity to serve the church with a biblical foundation and emphasizing the transformed life. We'd love for you to check us out at wbs.edu. Secondly, I love for folks to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerii.com. And if you sign up for my email list, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching, a tool that you can use in your own exegetical preparation to get you thinking ahead about the task of proclamation. So that's there. And then also, if you go to my website, you'll find more than 250 past podcasts. There are courses available, one on the afterlife, one on the book of Jude. These are things that Sunday school classes and small groups have been using. We'd love for you to check those things out at andymillerthird.com. All right. I am so glad to welcome into the guest, Dr. Leah Payne, who is a professor at Portland Seminary. She is the host of the Spirit and Power podcast. Leah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
When I saw your book in the Oxford catalog, I thought, whoa, this looks really interesting. So we're here to talk about your book, God Gave Rock and Roll to You.
Yeah.
And I already alluded to, I feel like there's going to be some moments here where we're tracing my history. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, because you said you worked at a bookstore.
I did.
And you said this would be like therapy. I've often talked about myself as I use theological language, like a confessor, because people will tell me, they'll just, tell me their life story. But I feel like I first need to ask a question. Who was your favorite artist or band?
Oh my, see, I knew it was coming. It depends on the period. So,
okay.
And you actually highlight some of this so well in the book. So I would definitely, if you would say what I listen to most on I'm going to be so dated through this thing. I'm just going to say at the front, I was born in 1980. Some of you are going to try and guess. But so because of that, I had a portable CD player, and probably what was played the most was DC Talks, Free at Last, and then probably Jesus Freaks.
Okay.
And some Wow Worship was probably on there too. But then this is what you highlight. So interesting. It gets like a little too commercialized. And then you kind of talk about the move toward the Western kind of front of Tooth and Nail Records. And so then I emerge on the, like many, on the ska scene. So there you go.
Okay. So now we're talking, what was your favorite ska band?
Oh man. See, I had friends who were in the Insiders, which were like,
no kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was part of my, but I liked all three. I like all three, Supertones, 5 Iron Frenzy, and Insiders. So yeah. Okay. Leah, how about you? Where do you fit in with this?
I wrote about this in the book that I grew up as a Pentecostal pastor's daughter. So of course, I was going to be completely immersed in that world in a lot of ways. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is that contemporary Christian music gets used as one of the marketers called it spiritual vitamins. So, but really it was used as a form of counter entertainment. As you know, I'm not saying anything that where there was a sort of parallel evangelical universe that ran. So, but the thing is, my parents were a part of the Jesus movement on the West Coast. And And so my parents loved Jesus music, which is the music of kind of hippieized Christians out on the West Coast. So people like Larry Norman and Second Chapter of Acts and those types of bands. So my parents loved that stuff, but my dad did not like contemporary Christian music. So
Oh, interesting.
anything from Amy Grant on was like thumbs down. So I was raised in a very strict Pentecostal household, but I was not raised with contemporary Christian music as my parents' media of choice for me. So that's like a really long way of saying I didn't really have that kind of like favorite band experience, but of course I knew it was there. I mean, it was all around,
Yes, yes, yes.
and so yeah, I think the funny thing is I've kind of come back to listening to all of that and
Oh, interesting.
found stuff that I actually really enjoyed. So, but I
Oh,
was raised with
interesting.
a lot of church music. So like praise and worship music, a lot of that stuff it was ubiquitous in Pentecostal circles and now it's become ubiquitous everywhere. But yeah, so sorry, I don't have like the kind of fun, iconic band that's like, oh, my band, but
No, that's
I
good.
love hearing about it.
No, it is so interesting. So I had about 2 years ago Lester Ruth on my podcast. Like your face makes me think, yeah. So, and he talked about the two streams moving toward contemporary music and how they come together. And he would have he identifies kind of like the Pentecostal stream as being connected to using particularly Old Testament imagery in songs and like singing scripture, whereas the other side was this attractional, make sure like push down walls of a seeker sensitive movement to do things as closely connected to what's happening in culture. And so I get maybe I'm getting what you're saying is like on the kind of Pentecostal stream that emphasize scripture, like a Maranatha music and integrity and these type of, would that have been where you were?
Well, I would say that Maranatha did both of those things at once. So
Okay.
they
Okay.
sort of take the form of rock music, which was, parental types for decades had tried to figure out how to keep rock away from young people.
Right. Right.
Not
Right.
successful, but Maranatha combined the sounds of rock with the old-timey theologies of Pentecostalism in a really compelling way. So
Mhm.
whereas you would have heard, Pentecostals and Wesleyans, of course, traded music back and forth for a long time, even when they were sort of at each other's throats in terms of their
Sure.
doctrinal and practical differences. They would
Yeah.
still sing each other's songs. So there's a lot of overlap there between the types of themes. I was just talking with somebody about like the kind of distinctions of the types of hymnody that gave birth to contemporary Christian music and are still really energizing. And I'm like, those folks, and I think holiness people fall under this category. They love blood songs, right? Like
Yes.
songs
Yes.
about the blood of Jesus. They love, and there's Old Testament stuff in there too. And I think when Lester is talking about that, I think he's talking about the latter rain movement up in
Yes.
Canada.
Yeah.
So yes, I would definitely say that all those things, like the magic of that praise and worship music, is that it put all those things together.
Yeah.
So it was like kind of laid back, wear a Hawaiian shirt from the
Yeah.
pulpit,
That's right.
that kind of thing, which would have been your upbringing. I mean, like that's the right era, right? Where like
Yeah.
all the
Yeah. For sure.
actors are starting. But I don't know, where did you grow up, like in the country
Yeah.
geographically?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for being interested. I grew up in the Midwest in the Chicago area. Now, I grew up while I'm in the Wesleyan Holiness tradition, and now I'm in the Global Methodist Church. And I'm very connected, and our institution's connected to things that stream from Asbury University and Asbury Theological Seminary and Wesley Biblical. Like we're kind of like all together. And interesting, like when you think about the history of those institutions, for instance, Henry Clay Morrison, the founder of Asbury University, his paper, which united this community, is called the Pentecostal Herald. And so, like,
Mhm.
so the way those things interacted, I'm not answering your question though. I grew up in a very small group within the Wesleyan Holiness tradition, um, ecclesially, but it's really well known. It's the Salvation Army.
Oh, of course. Yes. Yeah.
So
So
I grew up in the Midwest.
okay, I grew up in the Foursquare Church, and
Oh,
Foursquare was founded by a woman who was
Yeah,
raised by a Methodist and a Salvation Army person. So it's like if Methodism and Salvation Army had a baby, it would be the Foursquare Church, is what I'm saying.
absolutely. I know. I saw that in your book, and I thought, I wonder if she has much of a tradition in that. Yeah. Oh,
Oh
interesting.
yeah, yeah. They and both groups really like tambourines, I'll say.
Yeah.
And
Well,
music.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I saw you emphasize from Amy Simple McPherson this idea of the cathedral of the air.
Hmm.
But and William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, one of their descriptions was that the Salvation Army's external open air work was the cathedral of the open air. That was a phrase they used
Oh,
a
I
lot.
like it. I like it. That's
So,
great. Yeah. Yeah. She was such a she did a good job of like borrowing from a lot of traditions.
yeah, she did. Interesting. And now, are you still? Is that the tradition you're in now?
I'm no longer Foursquare, but I am uh very well networked in the Foursquare tradition. And my dean actually is or well, let's see here. I'm no longer Foursquare, well networked in the tradition. I love serving Foursquare pastors. I love just yeah, there's like the kind of cultural affinities. I don't think they ever go away. So
Yeah, sure, sure. I
yeah,
understand that.
yeah. So wait, so you grew up Salvation Army and then you became Free Methodist.
Global Methodist. Global
Global
Methodist. Yeah,
Methodist.
yeah.
Global Methodist. Sorry. I have a lot of Free Methodist friends too.
Yeah, I mean, same tradition, and we serve a lot of Free Methodist students here. Yeah, so I was six generations in the Salvation Army. My
Oh,
part of my family immigrated to the United States through the Salvation Army.
I was gonna
Um,
say it doesn't go back much further than
that's
that. Were
right.
they like founding families or what?
Yeah, yeah. In a sense, not like the booths, but we were. You could see it like this because many people who study generational pieces they say that's not possible. Well, I think what it was is my grandfather's great grandfather was an older man when he came to Jesus. Well,
Oh,
apparently in the
okay.
Salvation Army, then generate. So like immediately you had two, almost three generations. Um,
That is amazing. Okay. Wow, that's pretty cool. What do you all have like old uniforms and any
Yeah, they still. Yeah, and actually, if those who are watching on YouTube, I do still have like there. You can see up above there. I have a Salvation Army flag in the corner in my
Oh, that's
office. So
cool.
it's like
I love
still,
that.
like you probably. I don't know. Like the just a few things you said there. It's still a part of it's the context in which I was discipled. And so I'm thankful for what came through that, and also a distinct approach to music and church music as well. Kind of like I don't know if you actually, can't remember if you highlight, they didn't make it big. Jeff Moore and the Distance.
They're in there. Yeah.
Okay, forgive me for not seeing it.
Yeah, yeah. It's really hard in terms of how I did because I still owe, I feel like, to people who read the book, like an essay that says why my favorite band isn't featured more prominently in but yeah, and really that's because the method of the book is I wanted to look at the most influential forms of contemporary Christian music. So I did chart toppers, so
Okay, okay.
like the top 40. Because if you get below 40, the influence is pretty minimal in terms of, I mean, they might be really influential in a few people's lives, but in terms of the kind of like big data, like sociological influence over evangelicalism, it's not quite as much. And then I look at the top 40, but then it's so hard with contemporary Christian music because it's based on content, not style. And
Yeah,
so it's really hard although there is sort of a if you turn the radio dial, you know what you're hearing usually.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
but ostensibly it's not really about that. But so then it's sort of hard because it's hard to divvy up or keep track of all of them. So what I ended up doing was dividing them according to types. So
mm,
for example, I would have the like female singer-songwriter types. So I mentioned Margaret Becker, I eventually
yeah,
mentioned Jennifer Knapp and folks like that, but there's a lot of other singer-songwriter women who don't feature prominently in there, but so I use representative types. So when it came to the Jeff Moore and the Distance band, I would have I actually self-consciously made the choice to highlight Stephen Curtis Chapman because he was a little bit more influential,
yeah.
so
I think so. Yeah,
more, but there's like kinship between them. So Jeff Moore's in there, but it was so hard to make choices. And I've had people email me like,
Oh no.
why didn't you include, whoever? And it's like, okay, I feel for them. And you know what? I think it's really sweet that people love whoever it is they love so much. But what I try to say is think about it. I mean, I don't usually respond to the angry ones, but I hope that people can see that there's like, did I miss a type? If I missed
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
type, then that would be a whole other thing. Because it gets wild when you get into, you brought up the tooth and nail catalog, and that in and of itself is like a million different,
Yeah.
forms of music. So anyway, I did my best. I did
Well,
not succeed in every
well,
way.
here's why I bring up Jeff Moore in this
Yeah.
instance is because he got on a Salvation Army kick.
Oh,
So
did
in
you
this case,
really?
so he in Jeff Moore when it was Jeff Moore in the distance, I didn't follow them that close, but
Yeah.
he found a line from William Booth that said, "Why should the devil have all the good music?"
Uh-huh.
Right, and so then he wrote a song on that. Well, then the Salvation Army is like, "Oh, we want this guy," and so then he wrote another song about the Salvation Army, "Heart to God, Hand to Man," and a few other things like this. So that's part of what started to bring the Salvation Army into that game. Though they were there, the Salvation Army developed its own type of uh, uh, British music tradition with brass bands, but it was meant to be. It was a popular accommodation to try to get to the masses, so to speak.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I wonder if Larry Norman knew about William Booth, because
Ah,
his
interesting.
song, "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music," is so iconic, and I think it's fascinating. It's fitting that a contemporary Christian music person would have an affinity with the Salvation
Yes.
Army, like with that posture, because
Keith Green did as well. A
yeah,
real
oh
fascination
yeah,
with the
I know.
Salvation Army.
Like he was really an interesting kind of budding historian before he died. But
Interesting.
yeah, so I think there's like it's a similar kind of revivalism and a real engagement with popular culture that is a pretty distinct, I think. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
This
great.
is so interesting. I haven't even talked about the book yet. Like I was like, so God gave rock and roll to you. You're chronicling this history and the things that led to it, and like some of the foundations that we have. So you have like the roots that come through revivalism, when it gets started. This is all fast, and I can't help but give like another little caveat with my own personal story. So I'm in this kind of subculture, but I also have a family that's really influenced by and all of this. I actually say of deep appreciation. Like I think many have looked at, say, purity culture and the like of the 1990s, and there's some certain abuses that I want to avoid. But I was at some of this might sound negative to me eventually, but I just want to say at the outset, it's like a God used this culture and the best of it impacted me in my discipleship in a great way. So like yeah. So I had that like I ended up being homeschooled midway through my schooling experience. My family was like no secular music, and the word secular came up
Oh,
a lot. It's like you get okay, there's this or there's that, and so we get Salvation Army music and we get Christian contemporary music. Even if we can't understand the words, we are going to have Christian contemporary music, and so that was a part of all of those cultural things. Where and so I then go choose to go work at a Christian bookstore because I wanted to help people know DC Talk existed, right? And then it kind of like brought so it was legalistic to a certain degree, but nevertheless it was I look at it. I was singing. I have a 13-year-old daughter. I have three
oh,
teenagers,
oh
and
my
I
goodness.
started to sing this. I started to sing to her, rap to her. I kind of girl. Okay,
Oh
DC
no.
Talks kind of girl. And I said, look, this is what your mom. I used to sing, and she said something to me based upon the type of Christian music she has today. She's like, why don't I have songs like that?
Oh,
Is
she
that
should
kind of
read the
interesting?
book. Yeah, she
Okay,
should read the book. She could find out. Yeah.
yeah. So tell us what. Now help me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I'm not going through chronologically, but
No,
what's
that's
going
it.
on? I mean, I just gave all sorts of cues of what's, and you highlight
Sure.
almost every sentence I had there. You provide a historical foundation for how we get there. So I don't quite know. I
Yeah.
could just walk through chapter by chapter, but it's
Oh,
all kind of entrenched there.
yeah. First, I think it's really important. One thing that I tried to capture was the wide scope of responses to contemporary Christian music. So there are, for some people, it is, they have almost a gag reflex, when
Sure.
CCM comes up because they associate it with negative parts of their past. And I capture those stories. There are some people for whom contemporary Christian music, I think the most poignant um, evidence that I ended up putting in the book, and I didn't even include all of them, is from obituaries.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I wrote my great aunt's obituary, and I know that it's actually expensive to write an obituary. They charge you kind of by the word. And when I started doing research for about contemporary Christian music, I put a Google News alert on my thing, just contemporary Christian music, and a few other things, just to kind of like keep track of the conversation. And what I didn't expect to find was how many times contemporary Christian music, that phrase, was included in obituaries. So
Wow.
it was so formative in people's lives that their loved ones thought, I'm going to include this in the account of their life and death. And
Wow.
it was such a core part of their spiritual experience. So I try to include the breadth of those experiences and to get at its power, because regardless, if you put it in your obituary or you kind of want to throw up when you hear it, that means that signals power either way, right?
Yes. Yes.
So so that's what I tried to include, in part to explore what happened to the coalition of evangelicals that gathered under the banner of evangelical, and like what has happened to them now. So I think
Mm.
like responses to CCM actually illustrate a lot of that. But I would say to the question of the kind of messaging that was in especially artists like DC Talk, but a lot of the, I call them youth group bands,
Yeah. Yeah.
DC Talk's by far the most influential, but then you have Audio Adrenaline
Yeah.
and Newsboys. And the types of messaging that was included in those is almost non-existent now, in part because, or
Right.
a few different reasons. One is that worship music is oriented toward liturgy, right? So it's unusual in an evangelical worship service to have a song that is full of moral prescriptives as
Yeah. Yeah.
part of the worship. So some of it just has to do with what do we use this music for now, and what people used contemporary Christian music for in a lot of ways was a way to provide a safe alternative to top 40 music, but then also not just a safe alternative, to provide a counter narrative to what or at least the perception of what mainstream culture was offering. And so that's how you get those types of songs. And some of them, like it's kind of funny. I'll be at conferences that are not church based at all, and people will sort of like out themselves to me, and and just like start repeating lyrics of many different kinds of songs. And that has been a really delightful part of it, because I did not expect that. It's like you make a lot of new friends. So, but yeah, that's what I would say is like that's kind of the reason why those types of songs are no longer present in because the demand for it has gone down. And I think that's and this people sometimes feel a little uneasy when I use this language, but I use it in very neutral term. It's a business. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the industry serves a market, and the market shifted. And so the market no longer really has a place for that in at the scale. Now, there's always going to be alternatives, and I think if you just look on Instagram or TikTok, I find TikTok to be completely overwhelming. So I think it's like an age thing. So, but Instagram, you see people who are doing things that are kind of akin to that. Like they'll do. There's a duo, and I need to keep track of them. I follow them, but I think they're brothers, and they do like um Christianized versions of pop culture songs. They're pretty
Oh, interesting.
produced, so like there are efforts to do that, but there's not like this entire industry that with all of the evangelical institutional power that went,
Right.
because when you were working at a bookstore, which we have an episode on this podcast I host called Bookstore Guys, because I talk to a lot of guys. Most of them are guys who work
Uh-oh.
in stores. A
I
lot of
didn't know
guys.
there's a category for me.
Yeah, well, I made it up
Okay.
because I just talked to so many guys who were like teens, who just for a lot of different like entry points, but they end up at a bookstore, and very funny stories about the guys who would kind of get into conflicts with the bookstore manager over which music to include, and
Yes, I had this.
I love that.
I
Okay.
had this exact same thing. I was the Christian contemporary music manager at 16, right? That was why I was brought in. And that meant if there were 30 shelves, that I had 2 shelves, right?
Love it.
And I remember trying, and there was a group at Diamante Music, which was like the kind of the source. And so I like would call and find out what was, even with this, even as I'm saying this, like as the move happened from mainstream Nashville based groups, DC Talk, even Jars of Clay to a certain extent, there was a little resistance to, whoa, what are we doing with this tooth and nail type of stuff? Like that. It's almost like you got back into a Bill Gothard. There's actually sin in the rhythms.
Yeah.
And so I had resistance to doing it. And even I remember it's like kind of clear moment. There was this band called Dakota Motor Company.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know why I say it like as if and so
your listeners are Googling it right now.
Okay, there you go.
Good work,
so,
everybody.
I remember playing this, and like my parents, to their credit, if they made this restriction, they listened to all of it with us. And I remember playing that CD, and my mom said, "What's Christian about this?"
Uh-oh.
I'm like, I don't know. I bought it from the Christian
reason
bookstore.
for the hope within?
I know. That was part of what I had.
I think that story is such a great story because it illustrates why it illustrates why the industry or the effort behind it was kind of unsustainable, because a lot of mainstream contemporary Christian music, I think the thing that I try to not get overly repetitive, but I try to emphasize is that from the outset, the core consumer was supposed to be an evangelical adolescent, but the core customer was that adolescent's mom. And if there's anything you need to know about, young people and pop music, it's that they don't want their moms buying music for them, right? And so I think that's what, your those tensions were happening all over the place, right? Because at the end of the day, what made Jesus music, so the music of Larry Norman and Second Chapter of Acts and Keith Green and stuff, so successful, I think, was really, it was peer-to-peer music production. So these were young people making music for other young people. But the mechanisms of the industry were very parental. So even from the beginning, Billy Ray Hearn, who is one of the most influential, a brilliant businessman, very well loved in the industry. He got his start as a Southern Baptist youth pastor. And so there's this kind of youth pastorly concern, which is on the one hand made it really successful, because if you can like get into youth groups and get into those, then that's a market, right? Like, but on the other hand, for the long-term viability with American pop music, the kind of the point of most American pop music is to, I'll say it in like for teens to differentiate from the parents, right? So
that's right. Yeah.
Quote, rebel, So if they don't really get a chance to do that, then it's like the art form didn't really do its job in a kind of way. So so sweet that you were having, you're like, I include one really sweet story in the book about a guy who was just mortified when his mom read. So she had like I'm imagining, a magnifying glass looking at the little tiny notes, and she read a lyric she didn't like, and she called Tooth and Nail Records to like voice her, displeasure. And this guy sent me the funniest story about that. It was so sweet. It was so heartwarming. But that was going on everywhere. And, at the end of the day, it's not going to maintain over time because I have an 8-year-old who's like, Mom, I don't think you really know what is cool. And I'm like, you know what? I really don't.
Right, right, right.
So
Just give it, and you have a section on that. I found this section interesting. It's like building a Christian legacy, bookstores, and the buying power of white evangelical moms. And this
yeah,
kind of fits into that old documentary now on PBS Frontline called Merchants of Cool. I don't know if you saw, like, it kind of like there's these dynamics of like, this is a market that in the best sense needs to be served, but
right.
also there's a way that some need to exploit these markets. And
For
so there's a
sure.
little bit of both.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I think is, and I always have to be, I try to be careful with how I use this language because when I was talking with people who were working in the industry, they're totally comfortable with the fact that it is a business, right? And most of them are, I think we would look at them and say they're very devout people. So it's not,
Hey, friends, you might notice that we stopped there just for a minute. And those of you who are watching on YouTube will see that Leah and I are wearing different clothes. And
that's
actually,
true.
so we have, it's a month or so later, maybe even more than a month later, but in God's providence, this has been used to help me think. I was enjoying, Leah, I was really enjoying our conversation when we just had to be interrupted for a time. So now we've had a month, I've had a month to think about our conversation. So I'm glad we're back together here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and thank you for being so gracious. I had to run with there was a family emergency, but I'm back and thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Well, we were just talking about the business side of Christian contemporary music, and I had mentioned how, and then I saw this, and interesting enough, I'll just say, like, Oxford University sent me a link to digitally look at your book ahead of our last conversation. Well, I had about 45 minutes to an hour to look at it. Sadly, it just came late, but I ordered the book by 2 days later after our first conversation. I got it in and I was able to digest it a little bit more. Actually, my son wrote a term paper using your book. So this is kind of like a part of what.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Oh.
So it's given me a little bit more time to think about it. And I see you kind of like highlight the significance of the evangelical mom in the
hmm
1990s kind of settings. And I had just described to you like a little conflict where some of these Western California-based groups were coming on that didn't quite check the boxes of my evangelical mom. And so that was leading us to a place where we were thinking about, because like, well, my mom said to me, what's Christian about these lyrics?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yes.
anyways, we were talking about the reality of the business. And so
Yeah.
that got me thinking. I'm going to start us off with this way. I think this is a way. I have never done this on a podcast, but I am going to share artwork. I'm not going to call it artwork, but it's
Wow. I'm excited.
first
Okay.
time ever I've shared a screen. And then, so can you see this?
Oh, there you go. Okay. That's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the Christian bookstore. I already acknowledged that. And I'm a category, like
Yes.
a Christian bookstore. So
Yes.
this was the music section that I was responsible for at the Christian bookstore. So you can see here
I
that the
love
top
this.
of it, you have inspirational music, then Southern gospel. Then I
Yeah.
said on the
Yes.
side, like, and so if you're listening to this, just imagine shelves in a bookstore. Then Nashville music was like whatever that is. And that could be DC Talk. That could be other just kind of like Nashville based record labels. Then we had one little area for local music.
Oh, fun.
And
That's
then the
great.
very
Yeah.
bottom was like they let me have the tooth and nail section, but then black gospel music was also there. And
Right.
I actually am very intentional with like this is physically where these things were. But
Right.
then
Right.
there was a middle section in the like in between that had a listening station where
Oh,
you could
perfect.
listen
Yes.
and what
Uh-huh.
people, and then there's a Thomas Kincaid painting there that you could look at while you listened. And then there were demo tapes down below. So you could actually, but it had to be as a cassette player. But then
Uh-huh.
this is what is interesting as I finished your book, because then there was a whole section of praise and worship music.
That's right. That's
Which,
right. And it was getting bigger, I'm gonna guess.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is what's happening. And praise, it was like this pastel type of probably more from the tradition that you came from. And I had a little bit of a foot in there, like a inspiration or integrity music, kind of
Right.
like the not necessarily cool music, like what my kids
No,
might think of
yeah.
praise and worship
Right.
music. Then accompaniment tracks, or down below that, then VHS tapes. And so you would have people at these listening stations rehearsing their songs. And I appreciate this emphasis too that you had, that the accompaniment tracks, that's a significant part of the way this makes its way into the special music of the time. Now, what I suggest here is that what I read in your book was that all of these categories kind of come together or even disappear in certain ways. So I don't know if you're following kind of where I am, but like praise and worship music, as you describe it, becomes the forefront.
Yes.
So I'll let you just jump in however you want there.
Sure. I mean, first off, I absolutely love that illustration. And I just want to like go back to one detail, which was the Thomas Kincaid painting, because I think, I think like that big Nashville section that you have, well, the inspirational and the Southern Gospel and the Nashville section, I think a lot of people, like the biggest critique they would have of that music is that it would be like the sonic version of a Thomas Kincaid painting, right?
Yes,
Like very like, it's very pleasing. It's not in any way like challenging the person who's experiencing it. And then the tooth and nail stuff would definitely not fit into that Thomas Kincaid painting, which is why a lot of young people liked it. But anyhow, back to the praise and worship. I think I love that because what year would that have been?
So I would have worked at a Christian. This is like probably 95, 96.
Oh, good. Okay.
97. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah. So it's really interesting. The praise and worship stuff, I would say, was simmering right around that time. And I'm really glad that you put it around that, you were working there around that time, because a lot of people think that the praise and worship boom happened in the early 2000s. And I would say that that's when it went more mainstream. But the communities that were creating that music were trading stuff back and forth. Early on, I write just a little bit about it in the book, but early on, it was just these charismatic and Pentecostal churches who, from like the Jesus movement era, I trace that there's there are kind of two different directions that the music from the Jesus movement went. One was toward creating contemporary Christian music. So this kind of pop, alternative form of pop and rock, and eventually hip hop, that was meant to serve as a counter to the quote unquote worldly music around. But then the other direction that sometimes went is people stayed in the church and they were creating rock and pop music that was meant for liturgy. And that seems super obvious now, but back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was quite controversial. There have been a lot of books written that I don't need to write. They've already been written about the so-called worship wars, where there were just arguments about what kind of music would honor God in a liturgical space. Was it choral? Was it a band? And long story short, bands won, right?
Sure.
And it's really fascinating, how they won and why they did, but they won on a global scale, which that's something that I tried to pick up on in the book, which is that while there was, I think of it as a British mod rock sound, that it's a very common
Sonic
thing.
Flood, these types of Delirious.
When people say everything sounds like Coldplay or U2 or whatever. In the book, I called it like a British invasion, in praise and worship. That's maybe the most well known. But what isn't as attended to is that from the 70s, 80s, 90s, these charismatic and Pentecostal communities were trading music back and forth around the globe. And they were creating a much more transnational sound. So like there's the British version that takes off in mostly white megachurch spaces. But if you listen to a lot of those praise and worship albums, one of my favorites, because I wrote about music, I like to pull out my favorites. But as a child, my favorite, one of my favorite worship leaders was a guy named Ron Canole. And
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh man, he's the best. And if you listen to Ron Canole's albums, you hear so he's a Black charismatic who worked a lot in multiracial and white
Yeah, yeah.
charismatic spaces, which is how I came to know him because I was raised in the Foursquare Church, and he's huge in Foursquare. And
Okay.
anyway, so but if you listen to his albums, just the actual sounds that go into them, they're very global. Like there are people who
Yeah,
are
yeah.
collaborating all around the world. And that is the type of music that was, I think, creating a shared identity to the point where if something that I trace in the book is the political ties as well. But I think it's important to note that there are just a lot of strong cultural ties in these
Right.
communities. So, for example, a mega church in Orlando has really strong connections with Brazilian mega churches and Mexican mega churches. And it's not just that people are trading music back and forth; it's their like close family connections, like intermarrying, like one daughter from a mega church will marry a son from a mega church, and then they
Wow. Yeah.
create their own, so there are these kind of connections that you can see in those 1990s. That praise and worship section was not that big of a part of the market at that time,
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but now it is. I mean, in particular, or not in particular, like the Christian bookstore now mostly doesn't exist.
Right,
And
right.
so, but what does exist now is this thriving worship music business. And they don't need a bookstore. That's the fascinating thing. Like they have their own ways of being and pray, like this transnational praise and worship community. They thrive in the kind of unregulated streaming space. They don't need, there's a lot of complaints about the types of worship music that gets made. And they don't really exist around or need gatekeepers.
Mm.
And that's something, like traditional institutional church people really wrestle with.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, so I don't know. That's just what I was thinking of when you were telling me about that praise and worship section.
No, yeah.
Fascinating.
That praise and worship section is different than this is. So like that 1995, 1996 makes that distinct because it
Hmm.
was a little bit more. Ron Canoli might have been like the kind of pinnacle of that. I don't know, pinnacle, but like
Yeah,
as the person who's selling this, like that was part of that. But there was these like even the colors of the album covers, like it had this.
totally.
Yeah, it's just like a very different thing. This when I said not cool, it was different than what was happening in most churches. But I think I'll keep going this. I want to come back
Yeah,
to the Jesus Freak 1992 2000, but I'm
yeah.
curious what happens then in early 2000s. And I know the answer because I've read it here. Like we start to get reform movements. The
Right.
How do all of a sudden Southern Baptists and the like then start to embrace almost, I would say, that kind of culture that you describe, this almost uh praise and worship choir that's behind what's happening. It's like this reflective, charismatic um kind of jam session. I don't know how else to say it. That's just like
Yeah, that's
or
good.
like let the spirit move session to extremely well produced elevation music that we have now. So like there's this whole trend
Yes.
that it like starts. You document this from 2000 on to where we are now. So help walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that question because you're right. It- it's really interesting. I talked to a lot of the folks who were involved in creating those albums, and as you say, they're not that cool. The pictures of the albums, and usually they feature a congregation, not a worship leader.
Right.
And initially, for example, kind of the original, um, and probably still to this day, one of the most influential worship houses, I would say, is the Vineyard, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which one really important distinction about Vineyard music is that it's really closely connected to the Vineyard movement. So particular churches and a particular network of churches. An institution is what I'm saying. And
Yes, yes.
one of the things that they were really careful about doing was they wanted to emphasize the congregational experience over the particular worship leader. And
Hmm.
that so on those albums you wouldn't see a picture of the worship leader. You would see some sort of kind of and like a cartoon
Yeah,
drawing,
yeah.
like a music notes or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
And a lot of the early integrity stuff did too. Now, integrity worship, which is kind of one of the historically larger, more influential creators of worship
Yeah.
music, they're also a bunch of charismatics. And in fact, CCLI, the licensing organization that the vast majority of churches in the United States who don't use like sheet music, that it comes from a charismatic church in Gresham, Oregon. So they're all like, it's a very small network actually of people who are all kind of working together. And those folks early on really showcased the experience of being in that worshiping community. So they would do things like they would mic the congregation so you could hear
Yes,
the
yeah.
congregation. And if you listen to it, that's a really fascinating innovation. It's thrilling, right? You feel like you're there. And I would say a 2020s version of that would be the incredible videos that Maverick City and Elevation Music create. So you sort of feel like you're
Yeah,
there, even
sure.
though you're
Yes.
not. And so they created this invitation really to people to come and have this type of experience. Probably the most over the top Pentecostal version of that I can think of would be the Brownsville
Yeah,
revival.
sure. Yep.
They had
Yep.
a pretty successful worship album, and Brownsville, I mean, you can just go on YouTube
Yeah, sure.
and see just like very Pentecostal things. Like there's one where someone is bringing a voodoo doll and they're casting out demons. I mean, it's intense. There's
Yeah, yeah.
shofars. Yeah, and in the book, I write about how that revival actually created indirectly the band Sonic Flood,
Ah.
and so that those those kind of worshiping communities were creating a rock-driven sound
Hmm,
that
hmm.
they that was super successful and basically took over choral music and then the high production types of um, worship. So I think a great example would be comparing Calvary Chapel churches in Southern California to Robert Schuller's church worship experience, which
Oh,
would have
yeah,
been,
sure.
Crystal Cathedral. There's like
Yeah,
a
sure.
huge orchestra, and Christmas, they're like, we're bringing camels in,
Yeah,
and
that's
we've got,
right.
like that kind of stuff. That is really incredible and showy, but so expensive, as you know, right? No church in middle America or very few can afford to put that on. And so, but most churches can find somebody to play bass, can find somebody to like maybe poorly play drums or,
Yes, yes.
and so it was more accessible. Um, and I would
Hence the
argue
accompaniment tracks come in.
exactly. It's a lot more accessible. Yeah. And
Hmm.
and you can create like a pretty decent version of Vineyards Pour Out My Heart. It's not that hard to play,
Yeah.
and people can really get into it. Now, the it comes from charismatic communities that are, because you're from the holiness tradition. Pentecostals and holiness people are so interwoven with one
Yeah,
another
sure,
from the
sure.
get-go. And so I think it's a lot of the same theology that, Nazarenes and Foursquare people, they might disagree on paper about speaking in tongues, but they're going to agree a lot on things
Yeah,
about
sure, sure.
God and the things of God. They're not reformed, is what I'm saying.
Right, right.
And so reform people, I write in the book about how John Piper, super smart guy in a lot of ways. And one way was that he recognized the power of music as a vehicle for any kind of teaching, really. And he sought to create a worship version of Reformed teachings. So that is the moment where like Piper and the Passion worship
Right,
movement
right.
is really where charismatic feel of
Hmm.
and sound is baptized and becomes kind of Southern Baptized, Reformed, and or at least they try. And but the
Yeah.
tricky thing about it is that like you can try to discipline some of the mysticism from that
Yes,
worship
yes,
music,
yes, yeah,
but
sure. Yeah,
it
yeah.
doesn't really work,
Yeah.
you
A
know?
good example of that is like, so, like, for instance, that tradition and in the holiness tradition, there is a heavy emphasis, and certainly in the Pentecostal tradition too, on the nuptial metaphors
Oh,
of,
yes.
so like, so this is
Yes.
how you get a movement from those circles that you're talking about to David Crowder teaching us all to sing the words sloppy wet kiss.
Well, okay, so that's my favorite part is that it was Kim Walker and Bethel who sang Sloppy Wet Kiss, but David Crowder was like, no, 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 no,
Yeah,
no.
right.
Yeah, Unforeseen Kiss, which is a troubling change to the lyrics, but this was like, so,
Yeah, yeah.
but
What's worse? Yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna lean like sloppy wet kiss as would be my choice over unforeseen kiss. Any,
Yeah.
no. But that idea was that you could like take the charismatic
Yes.
movement and kind of tweak it a little bit and then, put it in a reform space. And Crowder is an interesting character because he was in those passion circles, but he was always sort of dipping his toes into the kind of charismatic music. Matt Redman is another
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
person. Like in the book, I basically try to argue that even though, Piper and his group of people, probably the most notorious would be Mark Driscoll. They keep trying to import reformed theology in through this charismatic mechanism. But in the end, the form itself is too
Wow.
unwieldy because just what you said, like holiness people and Pentecostals, they love bride and bridegroom language. And that does not align with the very like the
Forensic sort of
yeah,
view of, yeah,
forensic, yeah, and the heavy emphasis on, providence and the just this kind of
sovereignty.
yeah, that which so in the end the mystics sort of win because
Yeah,
you can't
yeah,
discipline it
yeah.
out of that. So
Yeah.
and to this day, I mean, there are people are always trying, and sometimes I'll get emails from people like, do you know about this group that's trying to do kind of a more reform? And there are lots of groups who are creating incredible music across the theological spectrum. But my response is always, and what's at the top of CCLI? Like in the end,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
these, like it or not. And I'm not even saying that I always like it, but I'm saying, I don't know, like one of the funniest things that I found out right before the last edits were due to my editor, was that Elevation Church, which had been Southern Baptist. And
Yeah.
I would argue it was Southern Baptist in name only because Stephen Furtick is such a Pentecostal preacher. But so it had been Southern Baptist and then they disaffiliated. So now it is a non-denominational charismatic church. And that is essentially what happened. Is that,
Yeah.
churches are, American practitioners are disaffiliating in droves. But I like to put a little asterisk by that because if you look at the rise of non-denominational Christianity, which is not often tracked by like traditional means, you see something a little bit different. You see people who are worshiping in these kind of unregulated, unaffiliated, charismatic spaces. And the music was the first indicator. I think it's like the canary in the coal mine, right? Like
Wow.
how
Interesting.
how people and Billy Graham knew that too. Like he would argue that music was really important, and he famously said, he wished he would have used more music because it was so powerful to move people. And so if you look at how people are worshiping God through song, I think you see the future
Mm.
of how things will go. Yeah.
Yeah, and you bring this back at the very end. You mentioned the in your epilogue, you have this picture of like the elevation worship. and you mentioned them. It makes sense that you just found out about that, like as you're like
I was
publishing a book.
excited.
Yeah, it's like you got that.
Yeah.
But going back to the very beginning, kind of the
Yeah.
revivalist side of songbooks catching on, things that people could use, creating quartets that, all that like became commercialized,
Yes.
leading to the 1980s, as you said, your Heart in Motion chapter, and people pick up that cue, like leading through like kind of like this superstardom. But then it kind of makes its way back at the end, where your very last line, I think, is very indicative of what you're trying to say, because you highlight. I'm just going to read it here. Oh,
Sure.
get to
Oh,
it.
thank you. I feel really
But
honored.
there you go. But I mean, it's a bit of an indictment too, and I think it's good. I don't
Mm.
know. I mean, to me, it is. Live performance tracks were they're talking about Elevation Worship, this concert, Stephen Furtick and the like. They've disaffiliated, but live performance tracks were sold in the resource section. The official platinum worship experience purchased through Ticketmaster. You're saying a lot there. You're saying like this is like a
Yeah, it's true.
commercialized kind of reality. Was priced at around $165.30 per ticket. So it's like the commercial realities just keep on expressing themselves from the beginning, kind of your story
Mm.
to what now is like this point where you had to say you put your last period.
Yes, I didn't even say I didn't you could that's the official price. Of course, there were other much more expensive tickets available if you got them through sort of less official means. I am fascinated by the relationship between um, worship and industry.
Mm,
And um, and some of the people who I talked with when I was working on the book, the vast majority of people I talked with are very devout Christians. I have absolutely no idea or no doubt in my mind that they are completely committed Christians. And many of them also were, not all, certainly, but many um, interpreted the efficacy of their Christian claims through the marketplace.
mm-hmm,
So if
mm-hmm.
it sold, then that was the gospel getting out to
Right.
people.
And
There-
God was blessing it.
exactly. And you can see why in an industry that is born and then peaks during the American century. It's how would you interpret it any other way, in a lot of ways. So I actually understand that. And also a lot of folks who are creating the sounds of worship for an increasing percentage of American and non-American, like it's a global phenomenon.
Right, right, right.
Um, those types of interpretations of the relationship between the Christian gospel and the marketplace are um, not questioned very often in those circles.
Mm-hmm.
And someone asked me, I'm not a theologian and I'm not an ethicist. So every now and then people will ask me theological questions or ethical questions about this. And I really tried to just tell the truth as well as I could and to be even-handed along the way, and to consider as many, interpretations of something as possible. However, if I were to be pushed, I was once pushed, like, what is the moral of this story? And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a historian. I'm trying to like, tell the truth.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
why. But if there is one moral, I think it might be, it's an old one, that you can't serve two masters. You can't
Yeah,
serve
yeah.
God or money. You'll serve one or the other. Dylan wrote a pretty good song about that too. But of course, Jesus said it. And I think that there's something in that story where the overall story of God Gave Rock and Roll to You is the story of people who embrace the marketplace and then are surprised to find that the marketplace
Isn't
displaces.
Christian.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
true.
yeah.
Certainly
Isn't
true.
necessarily Christian. Yeah.
Yes, and which is not to say that it's anti, but
Right, right.
it's more like that the marketplace creates surprising events and surprising actors. And the people who think that they're using um the commerce for their own gospel ends often find themselves completely upended, like displaced.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, a lot of the people who were the most devout were Christian bookstore owners. And I'm sure you knew some who,
Yeah, sure.
and I hope that they were, I'm assuming that they were people who were just so excited to share Christian things with people and most of the folks that I talked with, including, people who are involved in like the upper echelons of that business, but then also independent bookstore owners, they just love God and were so excited to share their favorite things of God and considered themselves, they took it very seriously that they were theological gatekeepers, that what
Mm,
they chose was they were part of presenting the gospel to people. And, Amazon completely put them out of business.
yeah, sure,
And so
sure.
like that's one of the more I think, so when it comes to that last sentence about elevation, what I wanted to say through that was um that these communities are super resilient and also that they are interwoven with American marketing culture. And a while back in the olden days when Twitter, well, X was more of a place for people to like talk about things. I can't keep track of the conversation now. Like the algorithm is all weird for
Yeah.
me, so I don't use it very often. But back in the olden days, I just started going through to see how much does it cost to worship.
Mm,
And so I was trying to see like what are the hot tickets,
yeah.
and all I said was you could go see this band, you could experience this dollar amount per worshiper. And
Wow.
people got really there are lots of people who got really mad. But
Hmm.
I wanted to just observe that. And certainly, I put Ticketmaster in there. I mean, they're notoriously, I think Ticketmaster will go down in history as a very unethical business.
Yeah,
Like there's
sure.
no, I mean, I'm not worried about being sued for that. I'm not the first person to say it, like, so yes, Ticketmaster is a part of that. There are larger market forces that create these big ticket items. Well, that's exactly the moral of the book is that
Right.
when you partner with those organizations, then you your work is beholden to that marketplace and you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. This is so interesting. The way that the marketplace ends up dominating, it becomes this response to what we think we're supposed to be in the world. It's interesting timing because I how I do my podcast, I like schedule people generally for a whole day. So like I do
Yeah.
several interviews. So just before this interview, I had on David Emerton has a new
Oh,
book. Maybe
yeah.
okay, types of ecclesiology. So it's like
Okay.
very kind of systematic theological reflections, but he has four types and then proposes a new type. But I think where evangelicals often land and this tradition lands is what he identifies as the performative ecclesiology. Now he's not talking
Mm,
about performance, but it's
right.
like this tension between the the divine realities and human agency. And so and then the performative side sees the human agency as critical, like that
Mm,
we're trying to we have we need to work for God so that certain act so that he is better known, as opposed to the reality that the church exists in a sense, like in this kind of tension between God calling it into existence and us responding and being his church. And so like there's a sense that okay, well, I'm sure there could be people from Elevation Worship, which I'm sure I sing their song. Like I'm sure it's a part of my Christian experience right now. But to charge that much, or then to have like a personal experience where you can get a selfie with Stephen Furtick, I'm sure that costs a little bit more, right? Like,
part of the VIP. You got to
right,
pay
right, you get
VIP
in there.
prices. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and it's justified because it's our like, well, this is a group that's using all that they can to get the work out there to perform these actions on behalf of the church. But I think it misses some of the identity of what God has called the groups to be. I think maybe that's why I'm longing. I find myself longing for the description of the charismatic communities you were describing that didn't put the picture of the well curated person on the
Right.
the front of the album. Like there's some, and that was what was so interesting. You highlight this. I appreciate. I had friends who were worship leaders during the Asbury outpouring.
Oh, right. Okay,
And
that
so
was a
this
big
is like,
deal.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so this
And
is
I
that
read
same
about
thing.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's something I long for that myself.
I think it's one of the things that I try to capture along the way is that there were always minority reports. Like, I don't know if you've seen that movie. It's a pretty
Yeah. Yeah.
underrated sci-fi movie, but there's always a minority report. So there were always people who I think had a really unusual level of clarity and insight.
Mm,
I would, as a charismatic, I credit that to the Holy Spirit that they spoke up and spoke out about things. So one
Charlie
of the
Peacock, you mentioned
Charlie,
him. Yeah.
yeah, and
You're
he was my boss. I wrote about that. So he very wise person. John
great.
Fisher is another one who I loved quoting him because he used to write the kind of back page for CCM magazine. And he was particularly insightful as CCM was growing as an industry to say, like, this is being, um, like, we're interpreting its profitability incorrectly. Like, he was
Mm,
very, like, he had a fast, I mean, it was like a sermonic op-ed where he argues that when Christianity costs the church something, it's good for Christianity or for Christian communities. When it pays, we should worry.
wow.
And he basically says, this is, I think, in 1985. And he
Wow.
basically says, we're making too much money here. Like, we should be paying attention. So there are always people who along the way. They're not the majority, of course, sadly, but that is heartening to me, that there are folks who are recognizing some of the dangers. And I have actually maybe unpopular opinion about celebrity and I think that and the kind of performative styles, I don't necessarily think that it's bad. I think it can
Sure.
destroy people internally. There's no
Yeah,
doubt
sure.
about that.
Not good for
You just,
them. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's weird. There are ways though, and the holiness movement and charismatic
Yeah.
communities were pioneers in this way, where people on the margins can be authorized through their charisma. And sometimes we use that, we interpret that as celebrity, but so non-white
Yeah.
people, women, um
Amy Semple McPherson, a great example.
totally,
Yeah, yeah,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah, like she would have never had the platform that she had if she would have come up through traditional institutional
Right, right.
means. So, I have like a maybe um like I have a higher tolerance maybe because there's every now and then there's like a think piece that's like, the problem is celebrity. And I'm like,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know. Like I knew people in really dysfunctional churches with no celebrities, and they seem to manage to be dysfunctional,
Yeah, sure.
without
Absolutely.
without a famous person.
Yeah,
So
it's an easy target for sure, and I already kind of
yeah,
shot at it in the last few minutes. I mean, but I wouldn't deny like I still want I teach preaching. I still want my students to watch a little bit of Stephen Furtick because, like, by the way, he seems to
he's
land.
excellent.
Yeah,
Oh
he
my
seems.
goodness. Yeah.
So I want you, and I think the tradition I study in the Salvation Army was a celebrity leader who God chooses to use sometimes people, Billy Graham. I mean, certainly, like
Totally.
I says, this is, it's not terrible. It's not intrinsically bad. I think because there are abuses that might be the reoccurrence of causation as a result of
Yeah.
their celebrity.
Yeah.
And yeah, that can be a problem. But yeah, I don't think I want to be clear. I'm not
Yeah.
against
Oh
that.
no. I mean, what I appreciate about you bringing it up is that we have to be attentive to the intersection of that and Christian worship.
Hmm.
So, if the majority of the music that we're creating and as evangelicalism gets charismaticized.
Hmm.
um, for charismatics, worship is the sacrament, essentially. And I always
Mm-hmm.
joke with, I got into an argument actually with a Pentecostal theologian about it because he said, oh, preaching too. I'm like, no, 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 no. And I'll tell you why. Because you could have a charismatic worship service
With no
without
preaching.
preaching,
Yeah, yeah.
but you can't do it the other way around. And the only reason why I bring that up is like that is a major component of experiencing God for charismatics. And if we're not attentive to how celebrity and American capitalism in the marketplace are forming that major component of our Christian worship, then I think we're not attending to what the things that Jesus was thinking about. Um,
Mm.
and so we ought to think about God and money
Well,
and
yeah,
who we're
yeah.
serving.
And it should move to like the David Emerton makes this movement from the human side to also there's another contrast which thinks about the divine life as the total picture. So um the idea that being is communion, and
Mm-hmm.
we think about the inner life of the Trinity being told, well, that's beautiful. And also the place of sacraments, it helps connect us to the divine realities that can be guiding. So there's a balance, I think, that needs to be found between these sides, and sometimes it expresses itself in strange ways. And I think contemporary Christian music is one of the ways that there's good and bad that comes from it.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up because I initially when I was writing about it, when I would ask to interview people who'd been involved in it, they would say, well, what's your position on contemporary Christian music? And I didn't really have one, and I tried to, anytime I included a story where something was really, uh, a force for destruction in someone's life, I tried to also include a story about how it had been a source of life
Mm-hmm.
and joy. And so, yes, I think um, it was all those things.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it was, and when people talk about it, it's funny because I just gave a lecture in the Northeast, which is not CCM home territory.
Okay.
And I asked, does anybody here know what contemporary Christian music is? And one person raised their hand.
Wow.
And I was going to ask a follow-up, do you know what it is in your heart? Because because if you know it, then you usually have some kind of strong impression
Right,
of what
right.
it is. And I tried to capture the strength of it as a force of, joy and also sorrow. And it was just all those things. It was
Yeah,
complicated.
yeah. I mean, I know, I feel the same tension about purity culture, like it, but
Totally.
I talked about like I told my kids about, look, there was this song that DC talked that said, "I don't want your sex for now," right? And like I sang it to them,
They
and
did. They
I was
did
like,
do
but
that song.
like there's a lot of good critiques of purity culture that are there, but I'll say purity culture was good for me. Like it was a good. I'm not saying I don't think I swallowed it the same way that others did, but like I thank God for that emphasis, and I do worry a little bit. I'm like, man, I, I I'm guessing we're somewhere around the same age, and so like in youth, and I didn't have big youth groups, but I went to enough youth events where there's a lot of talk about sex, and my kids, their youth group experiences, that is not a part of what they're experiencing. And I'm like, well, let me make sure. I want you guys to make sure you get like this is comes from the home at least, but that was produced in the culture of the music.
Yeah, I tried to capture
You
the
did, yeah, you did a good job.
plethora of experiences that people had with that because yes, you're right. And I and there was the 90s were a wild time, because that's true. They, that uh it- purity culture and contemporary Christian music really went hand in hand because they're both concerned with adolescence. And so,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I read about in the book is that if you want to know what evangelicals were thinking about when it came to adolescence, just listen to contemporary Christian music. So at any point in time, you could capture a lot of that. And in the 90s, they were thinking a lot about that. And so there were a lot of songs, and some of them are sillier than others. And yeah, and a lot of responses that I got to the survey that I made about contemporary Christian music were about that. And there were
Mhm.
other things too, like apocalypticism, like a lot of
Yeah, yeah.
people had shared kind of funny stories about waking up in their house and being alone in the house and worrying if they missed the rapture.
I
And
wish we'd all been ready.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So there are
yeah.
a lot of different stories. And that was the adventure really for me of listening to contemporary Christian music, because I spent over a year really just going through. I just wanted to experience it, just to listen to it, to let it kind of wash over me, like, okay, what am I hearing? What am I feeling here? Like
Yeah,
listening to
yeah.
this stuff. And that was the fun part about it really, was you just kind of get like over time, like, oh, 9/11, that was a big time where people were purity culture actually was huge, but also patriotic stuff, um and
Yeah.
a lot of apocalypticism, because everyone was concerned that the world was gonna
Yeah.
in some way end. So yeah, it's fun. I My YouTube algorithm is wild because I've listened to a lot of
Oh,
it.
okay.
But it's been a really fun adventure.
Interesting. Okay, so I know we only have so much longer, but
Sure.
I want to hit two other things because
Okay.
you've highlighted them both. You mentioned the patriotic themes, and where we won't get into probably the 2000s sort of stuff as much, but um I love that you're able to emphasize Carmen. Giving us a little spot of
Thank you.
Carmen. And so the patriotic theme, and the I went to a free Carmen concert in the Chicago area, and I signed the pledge. I want God in America again, right? And so,
Oh,
and he told us all, look, I'm going to get I don't know, 1 million signatures, and I'm going to go tell the president of the United States, we want God in America again. I
hmm.
performed the champion multiple times. I was actually really
Were you
good at.
Jesus?
I was Satan. I was
Good for
Satan. And
you.
so,
Oh,
and I
that's a
got to be
fun
so
role.
so good at Satan in the champion that another church asked me to come and be their Satan.
You are
So
the guest Satan.
I was
That's
like,
awesome.
Satan.
That's so funny.
So yeah, so that kind it combines some of these themes, like a Carmen. And he really hits this in a unique. So I have to give a little tribute to this person who's now with the Lord.
I love that. My friend Dara Delgado and I, shout out to Dr. Dara Delgado, we wrote a think piece about Carmen when he died. Yes,
Oh,
he was it's in Religion News Service.
okay.
And we had so much fun writing that, by the way. It was just a hilarious good time. But yeah, he is somebody who throughout the writing process, I would bring him up to industry people, to a person. Industry people could not stand him.
Oh, I'm sure.
They didn't like, a lot of them thought his music was in poor taste, that his theology was heretical sometimes. So he was very unpopular with gatekeepers.
Oh, wow.
So I love that, because what that tells me is that is a case where the consumers overturned the
Wow.
gatekeepers. And what Carmen was doing was creating a Pentecostal rendition of the universe. Like, if you've
Yeah.
seen his music videos, somebody joked, I didn't come up with this, but I can't remember who told me. They were like, he was our Michael Jackson, because he would come up with like the Thriller video,
Oh,
which
yeah.
I would say would be a witch's invitation. And he created this very over the top, on the nose version of a heaven or hell, Satan or Jesus world. Satan Bite the Dust is another one, the
Right, right,
champion.
right.
And it was so imaginative. And the fact that he offered free concerts, you're not the first person. Many people, their very first concert was a Carmen concert. In fact, I heard an actor on the Kelly Clarkson show, I think he was in Yellowstone, saying that they were talking just randomly. Carmen came up, and they were like, that was my first concert. So he introduced a lot of people to live music, to
Wow. Yeah.
entertainment, but when I would bring him up to industry people, they were like, oh, cringe,
Yeah,
eye
yeah.
roll. But no, he was a singular figure. He occupied his own space on the
Yeah.
charts. I mean, like, who would you even compare him to?
Yeah. Oh
Um,
man.
yeah. So I also think, I joke about it with people because I'm just sort of a contrarian. So if someone tells me that he's not important, I'm going to tell you, yes, he is.
Yeah.
And he was, and he is, because look at you. Here you are, influential church leader,
There you go.
went to a Carmen concert.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to forget that you were the guest Satan. I think that's hilarious.
Yeah, it's just I don't know what it was about me, but this is all connected to it, like something else you highlight. I mean, this is what's so fun about your book is I mentioned the first section the first time we talked, like it's almost therapy for me. It's like walking through what I experienced and identifying these kind of major trends and how it fit. And the tension I feel is like I don't think it is just like a sociological expression of realities that were present, like a white Christian power dominated experience. I think like, yeah, it got off in some ways, but somehow God chose to use it. And there were abuses. There was a ecclesial sin involved in some of these decisions. But at the same
Mm.
time, like God really did use some of these offerings, and he used Carmen. People came to Christ because of his concerts, so
Well, that's one thing that I try to capture is that probably the most moving part of it. And I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier because now it's been like a month and it feels like I've lived a lifetime in that month.
I'm
But uh, the the most surprising thing. So I put a Google News alert on my like while I was writing about contemporary Christian music because I just wanted to see like what people were thinking about or talking about.
You did say this about
Okay,
how often it
yeah.
came with obituaries.
In
And I know, sorry to
obituaries.
interrupt you. Yeah, yeah,
No,
that's fascinating.
thank you. So I think that to me says how formative it was for people.
Yes.
And and um, of course, like most things, it's a mixed bag. But the its power in people's lives is undeniable, I think.
Yeah.
And I feel a couple of people have come up to me to say like I had to take a break a couple of times because it was just like kind of intense.
Yeah.
But I also think that that's a form of people reconciling themselves to who they were when they were really young. And
Sure, sure.
I hope that if someone's reading, because people who have no experience with contemporary Christian music have read it, and I'm sure they have a totally different response to it. But if that was a core part of your life, I hope that you can see, like when you're a teen, you don't always know, or you're not always aware of the bigger conversations that are happening around you. And I hope that there's a way for people to sort of situate whatever it was, the quirk of their
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
evangelical experience in a bigger context, um, so that those, Christian music festivals,
Yeah,
they were a
sure.
part of a bigger project in
Yeah,
a lot
yeah.
of ways.
With
And
his historical antecedents. And like,
totally,
yeah, so
yeah,
I loved
yeah.
the way you trace that out too. And as somebody who studies a similar period of history, like I like how you lay that at the foundation of
Oh,
what you're doing.
thanks.
Yeah, it's really good. I want to at least get this in. I love what
Yeah.
you did at the end with DC Talk, showing how the three leaders of DC Talk are indicative of what's happened in Christian music. So I know we don't have time to go into the details of it, but I thought the way you introduced DC Talk and what they did was really helpful part of this project for you. But then I didn't see the last chapter or so saying like, look, what happened with these three guys is what's happened with evangelicalism. Oh, Leah, sorry, you muted yourself. Sorry. Yeah,
Sorry about that.
no,
I
no
don't know how
problem.
I did that. Yes, um it's great that there were three of them because because it was a good opportunity to think through the state of this group of people that gathered together under the umbrella category of evangelical. And it's really Billy Graham's evangelicalism.
Mm,
And if we look at that coalition of people and you look at DC Talk, you can see that the sort of three paths. So the what I would classify as the kind of normie evangelical, I would put in the Toby Mac category. So
Okay.
Toby Mac is still creating a ton of music. He is an incredible business person and doesn't just create his own music. He's created a lot of really influential figures in the contemporary Christian and
Right.
gospel space. And he's pretty careful about what he says publicly. So while it's clear he's conservative coded, I would say,
Yeah, sure.
he doesn't make a lot of public statements about things. And so I think of that as the kind of form of Billy Graham era,
Interesting. Yeah, yeah.
where, the after Nixon, Billy Graham would try. I mean, he was always clearly a part of this conservative evangelical alliance, but he also was careful about his to manage his public political voice. And
Right.
then you have Michael Tate, who is if you know anything about his history, he has a longer history with the Falwell
I
family.
didn't know that till reading it in your book. That was
Yeah,
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah. So he grew up in that came up in that very fundy space, and now has become a very public and enthusiastic Trump supporter. And there are pictures of him, in the Oval Office with Trump. And so I think he represents the rise of that wing of evangelicalism, a very populist, charismatic form. It's predominantly, but not exclusively white. I think that's something that gets missed in the sort of, if we're going to talk about quote unquote the white evangelical vote,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of miss the charismatics because they're a lot more diverse. And so that's the Michael Tate wing. And then of course you have the ex-evangelical wing represented by Kevin Max, who I forget all the titles, but I included a social
Yeah.
media post that he made about himself, saying he was like socialist, something, something, something.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, if you catch most of that group, like the fates of most of that
Right. Right.
group through that trio. And I think people are wondering if they'll ever get together and perform again. I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, that's the big question. That's not the historian's job to figure out to predict the future, but
That's right. I can
that would
only
be.
tell you about the past.
I think people want it. People certainly. They would certainly drop. I think probably because of what's happened in those.
Yeah.
And that's a really good description of like kind of this middle of the road, but still, Toby Mac. It's just fascinating me. When I was serving the Salvation Army, I went to a concert just after maybe 2021 where it was him and a whole group of contemporary artists that were there. And the word contemporary is so funny too, right? Time
Sure,
with
sure.
time, like they're contemporary
Yeah.
now, but they wouldn't be contemporary. And it wouldn't be contemporary with what it was before. But but I was amazed. Here he is, close to 60 years old, maybe even 6 years old, dancing and doing all kinds of things, but kind of doing that task. And then at the same time, just recognizing like, what's ended up coming about is that like essentially that world where you would take and you would have a Kevin being like kind of like the Nirvana sort of grungy person, Michael Tate being like
Right.
the Seal, and Toby being this hip hop-ish kind of thing, and then they kind of blend stuff like that world of trying to say this is
Right.
the Christian that is gone, but we still have something here, and it is doing something, and then praise and worship kind of comes in, celebrity culture, this is still gonna, these themes are gonna persist. But what you've
Yeah.
documented for us is a real picture of what happened. And I
Mm.
appreciate you giving your skill as a historian to this task.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was really fun. It's always fun to talk with somebody who has both personal and then scholarly insight to it. So thank you for bringing your scholar brain and also your Carmen brain.
Oh man, it's out there now. Like people will know. I've talked about it before.
I love it.
Yeah,
Dun,
that's so
dun,
good.
dun. Yep.
Leah, oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Leah, what are you working on now? Like what do you? I'm sure this has been done for a couple of years. I'm sure. So yeah.
Yeah, right now I'm trying to get a proposal out the door for the next project, and I want to pick up a little bit that same conversation about how charismatics are have ascended in the global religious marketplace, to use the
Yeah,
term.
sure.
And and so I'm working on a book proposal. I hope to have that done by this fall. And I've just had a really good time continuing that line of thought about how Christian communities grapple with with what it means to be a Christian in the 21st century, how they use technology and media, and which ones grow and which ones don't. So that's been my obsession.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll look
Yeah.
forward to that. Like hope to keep seeing more scholarly work that
Thank
I
you.
think will benefit the church coming from you. So
Thank you so
thanks
much.
so much for your time, Leah. And thanks for coming
Thank you.
back later. It
Oh,
means a
thanks
lot to
so
me.
much for your patience and for having me. I really appreciated it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.